Want to be a part of our show? Send us a voicemail via our brand new 24/7 hotline for our podcast. Dial 845-208-5677. That's 845-208-5677. And your message could be featured in the next live episode of the Mets Weekly Podcast. Ryne Stanek is back with the Mets on a 1-year, $4.5 million contract to deepen the Mets bullpen even more. We all know that even though there is a few flaws, maybe he loses the strike zone a little bit, he can be a little wild. He is a stuff demon. Throws hard, ridiculous breaking stuff, gets lots of swings and misses, big high leverage arm. Adding him back, the gas tank is reloaded. Now, if you were to look at the Mets' overall bullpen depth chart, it's definitely deep in options, lots of flexibility right now. And we all knew that the Mets had a little bit of a struggle with the bullpen of who they actually could trust in some of these situations. We had quite a few blowups in that regard. Guys get hurt, such as Brooks Raley, Daniel Nunez, who is on that list. We know that Edwin Diaz had some inconsistencies. Ryne Stanek, when he got here, it wasn't that superb, but then he started to kick it into gear down the final stretch of the season. AJ Minter, a big add to this bullpen. Reed Garrett, we know, was definitely overworked a lot in 2024 and had some injuries because of it. So that definitely lowers his role. Jose Budo, who also could be a starting option. Griffin Canning was added right now in the opening day bullpen. Sean Reed-Foley, always injured, very talented arm, but always injured. Huascar Brazoban is another one, has control through 2029, wasn't great. Tyler Zuber was another arm that the Mets acquired at the trade deadline from Tampa Bay, and he did not pitch an inning for them ever since, but he may be somebody that is looked at as a factor. Max Kranick was on the Mets postseason roster for a little bit. I think he pitched once in a mop-up duty or something. He also could be a possible starter. He's been before, not something that you can really take to heart because he's had a lot of injury history, so most likely he's not going to be a starting option. We know Tyler McGill is there. He can make a start. Wouldn't recommend it. Justin Hagenman was somebody that they brought in on a split contract. Kevin Herget claimed on waivers in the offseason. Austin Warren is another one as well. I'm definitely seeing a lot more arms that I can trust. Frank, can you agree? I think that this bullpen's definitely gotten a lot deeper, and hopefully fully healthy, we can have a little bit more reliable sources from it.
Another name to always consider when you're talking about the Mets bullpen is Clay Holmes. Whether that's in the regular season or the playoffs, he's definitely someone who could be in this mix at some point as another, even not necessarily the high leverage guy, but someone who could get some saves and could be used later on in games and has experience closing. To have that as another option is very important because you don't know how Nunez is going to be back from his injury, and then you're hoping that one of these other guys like a Hagenman or a Warren or one of these other guys, a Zuber, could step up. And you really want Brazoban to be who you traded for. Because he was a big-time disappointment. The Baseball Savant page looked good. The eye test did not look good. So, there are some certain things that definitely could be improved. And, for Stanek, you want the playoff version, not the regular season version. Same goes for Garrett. Budo's the opposite. So there's a few guys you feel good about, though. Diaz and Minter for sure. And you feel better overall just going into the season. Whereas last year we knew that there was Diekman, there was Ottavino, and some other guys we really were just unsure of altogether. So you definitely feel much better this season from the beginning.
Now, one thing that has been talked about on this show amongst you, Frank, and as well as you, Andrew, talking about a lot of guys who have closing experience, kind of backing up with Edwin Diaz, of course, with him making as much money as he is. You're not really going to, get that much of a pursuit of some of the frontline guys who are going to get closer money on the market, such as, Tanner Scott, whether it's also Blake Triton, somebody like that, Carlos Estevez, who just signed last week. I know the depth is a few question marks, some guys that go in and out. But as for the back end, if you were to say, with this bullpen, I think this is one of the best in the game, I would say. One of the best units on paper. Who knows the consistency? But I'd say that this has become, this offseason, a pretty decent strength, I'd say, for this team, especially from the back end compared to what they had last year.
In the upper echelon, you want to say the top third of the team of baseball? Yeah, definitely. But it's too, you feel more confident because, yes, Reed Garrett had that breakout last year, and you see Danelle Nunez, two guys that none of us knew who the hell they were. Majority of us last offseason, name took the strides. You know that David Stearns is going to find guys, and hell, there could be more minor league free agents or minor league deals in spring training invites that potentially could be done and still be done before spring training. So I think you definitely feel a lot more confident because you have a better back end. You bring Stanek back to lower Garrett and Nunez again. Again, you're banking on relievers to have some consistency. Again, not the position. Consistency is the great, most dependable. But again, like you said, it's definitely an improvement of what it is. You move Brazabon down, Zuber down in the depth chart to say Sean Reed Foley coming back, who, has had his moments of being great. He just can't stay on the field. Like, the bullpen overall can be a strength. I think it's more trust dependable than the rotation. You could say on paper, I think more fans would say they'd be a little more confident in the bullpen than they are in a rotation. But again, it's still a strength, and it's good to see, that David Stearns knows what he's doing in the bullpen, and you can trust those guys. And you also know the 13 guys in the bullpen on the pitching staff on opening day is not going to be the same 13 on July 31st. So there's going to be adjustments and tweaks made. But at least going into the regular season, you feel that back end is great. And then we'll see. Hopefully, you get this year's Reed Garrett and Danelle Nunez. And maybe it's guys on that list. Maybe it's guys that are currently in AAA that we have no idea who they had. Can continue to deepen this pen. But it's definitely can be seen as a strength.
Hopefully we do get a little bit more of the consistency that we were hoping to get from Ryne Stanek. He was struggling a little bit, had a lot of back issues, and it seemed like the Mets were able to get a little bit more of that whole thing configured a little bit, whether you're talking about it from their pitching lab or whatever. I think that when it comes to, a guy like Stanek who could have some closer stuff, possibly. We've seen Danelle Nunez be in these high leverage situations before. Relievers can be so finicky because then there could be possibly somebody on that list that I just showed in the back end who does not pitch well and ends up getting DFA'd. I think that it got deeper from the back end, and for most importantly, in my opinion, gave you a little bit more of a pillow for Edwin Diaz. I know he likes to pitch a lot, but again, when it comes to the overall usage of the bullpen, it was taxed last year. Some guys that can give you length, some guys that can lock things down, some guys with closing experience. I think that they've done a really good job here.
The big thing for me is that, like you said, you just have more guys who are reliable in general. But what I want to see is, do you have enough guys who, if you could bring in anybody with a 5-run lead in the 9th inning, and a high leverage guy does not have to get warmed up in the bullpen, because that's where the overusage comes from. And guys come into games where they really shouldn't have to. Like, even if Nunez has to come in to get an out, it's like the fact they even had to warm up is just not a good indictment of your other pitchers. And like we said, if you can't trust them in all scenarios, then why are they in your bullpen to begin with? I mean, I think for the Mets, if I'm not mistaken, at least in the Brewer series, it felt like maybe about half of the Mets bullpen was not used. I mean, that's pretty concerning if at least half of your bullpen you feel like you cannot use. I mean, because we talk about, Brazabon was not used, Ottavino wasn't used, Danny Young wasn't used. I mean, like, there was a bunch of guys that they were just avoided at all costs. And you're like, okay, we could only use Garrett and only use Stanek and Diaz and Budo to some extent. But for somebody like Garrett in his first postseason, I mean, that's pretty unrealistic. Just be like, oh, here's like this new workload and we're counting on you to kind of bail us out here in the middle of the game. Like, that's not the way that he's supposed to be used. I mean, I've looked at his numbers, and I mentioned it like during the regular season, but he's someone in particular who is so much better the more rest he gets. If you work a Reed Garrett back-to-back games, he really loses that effectiveness, and we saw the injuries he had this season. So if they're just able to use their guys in a much different way and keep them more fresh, it's not going to make them better, but they're going to have less injuries in general if they're not overworking certain guys.
Want to be a part of our show? Send us a voicemail via our brand new 24/7 hotline for our podcast. Dial 845-208-5677. That's 845-208-5677. And your message could be featured in the next live episode of the Mets Weekly Podcast.